Good evening. On behalf of the Modern East Asia Research Group at Catholic University, I welcome you all to this discussion of elections in the Asia Pacific. My name is Máté Szakályi. I'm a research assistant here at the research group, and I shall be the moderator this evening. We aim to assess the processes, the results, if any, and the context of three strategically important elections in the region, namely the general and presidential election in India last April and May, the general and presidential election in Taiwan this January, and the ongoing campaign season in the United States for the elections this November. Let me introduce to you three distinguished experts who will function as our speakers during the discussion. In the chronological order of the elections, Mr. Budapest Mukherjee, who is a Doctor of the Science of Law candidate in comparative constitutional law at Central European University. Professor Tamás Matura, who is an expert on contemporary China and an assistant professor at the Institute for International Relations at Providence University of Budapest. And Professor Péter Marton, who is an expert on international relations, security policy, and American foreign policy, and an assistant professor at the Institute for International Relations at Providence University of Budapest. Thank you all for accepting our invitation. We shall start the discussion by exchanging views on the elections and the campaigns itself. Then we shall reflect on the state of democracy in the countries mentioned and in the Asia Pacific in general. So please, gentlemen, join me here.
That's free. Any preference on what they did?
No.
Just sit there.
It's okay. Thank you. So let me start with the processes first. In case of past elections, what were, and in case of the US elections, what are your pre-election preferences and were they met? Let's start with India.
So my pre-election sort of predictions was not as widespread a victory for the Bharatiya Janata Party, who we should refer to as the BJP in the course of this, as this, because in the 2014 elections, they had 272 seats out of a lower house seating capacity of 543. And just prior to the elections, there were a number of state level elections in which the BJP had lost pretty badly. So it was generally assumed that this inertia, this momentum of subnational parties would translate into electoral gains for some of these subnational parties, as well as the main opposition party, which is the left of center Congress party. But what had happened, of course, and this is something we'll continue to unpack in the course of this talk, is that there were certain foreign policy events which occurred, and this led to the BJP winning 303 seats out of 543 on its own. It increased its vote share by about 6 percentage points. The percentage point vote share for the main opposition party, which is Congress, pretty much stayed the same. And so in response to your question as to whether there was any sense on the ground whether this would be as widespread and as comprehensive a victory for the BJP, probably not, no.
But they still have to form a coalition to govern, right?
No, they did not. So they had crossed the majority mark but on their own, and along with their allies, they went up to 353 seats out of 543, which is pretty large. They increased their combined vote share of the BJP and their allies increased from 39% in 2014 to 45% in 2019. So it was a pretty resounding victory for the BJP and its allies.
Okay. In case of Taiwan, was it a landslide victory for the DPP?
It was good evening. Hi. It was, I think, a really interesting year in Taiwan. So let me give you some details. So in January, incumbent President Tsai Ing Wen was supported by 35 to 40% of the population, while her counterpart of the Kuomintang was supported by 55 or even 60% of the population. This has changed so dramatically that by July they were even, 40–45% both candidates, and we know the results that she won the elections at a rate of 57%, casting altogether 8 million votes, more than 8 million votes, what was a new record in the history of Taiwan's presidential campaign. So on the one hand, it was kind of a landslide victory, and it was a huge surprise compared to the situation we witnessed in January.
In the case of the United States, what are
It's always election time in the United States.
Yeah.
Given that there are congressional elections every 2 years, it guarantees that domestic politics is always going to put on a show. And in terms of my expectations for the last congressional elections, well, they turned out as expected mostly. Of course, everyone knows that the result of those congressional elections fed into the end result of the most recent highly relevant political process, which was the impeachment process, which again brought results that were largely to be expected. Republicans backing President Donald Trump in the US Senate, and resulting in the kind of outcome that I think basically everybody expected, which is not to downplay the significance of the issues that were involved, which are, I think, of such a nature that really it can be looked at in various ways, let's put it so. And so what this means is, of course, we have Donald Trump on one side. Effectively, he is the Republican candidate unless something unforeseen happens. And on the other side, there's the competition that's ongoing at the moment. There's still a lot to be seen, so it's currently the time of the primaries. I think everyone's following the news mostly. And so you know the results coming in from yesterday as well. You know who's in the race. Actually, not everyone who's in the race is directly involved in the competition just yet. Bloomberg is set to still join the race, but for now it's a race between Sanders and Buttigieg. And well, we're going to see what happens by Super Tuesday, but there are some predictions already that even at the time of the convention, it might be a contested issue, who's going to be the Democratic candidate. And we'll see how this turns out. I mean, it comes down to a lot of issues. It's quite complex. Campaign financing is a big issue, so if you want to be in the race, you have to spend a lot. And there are some people who are already running low on potential financial contributors, who are sort of maxed out contributors. Joe Biden is surprisingly one such example. And so a lot of it comes down to money, in fact, and how economic you are in your effort early on so that you can maintain momentum. Of course, what can help you later on in the race is if other candidates step back and endorse you, and then perhaps their financial contributors can still come to your help. So there are ways of sustaining momentum, but it's going to be increasingly hard for some of those candidates who have not done well so far in the race. Andrew Yang's just announced withdrawing from the race. So it's going to narrow the field, but only very, very slowly. And that's actually becoming an issue in terms of the prospective outcome of the elections, because if the Democratic side spends too much on these early battles, between themselves than what happens during the stage where the ultimate candidate is going to be facing Donald Trump. So this is interesting to watch in that respect as well.
On the system level so far, can we see any difference from previous election seasons? Like it is more digitalized, for example?
I think it's a trend that's been ongoing since a while, but certainly these trends are perhaps further enhanced in terms of what we see. Some observers talk about political parties in the US, the main political parties becoming empty shells, mere platforms for bases between personalities, and that doesn't help healthy politics maybe, because it comes down to a race between the more colorful sides of different personalities, and the scandals, and basically any small issue that you wouldn't expect at this point in time to matter, but could ultimately become really, really big later on. This is not unprecedented, but perhaps we're living in times where this is more characteristic of what's going on. And I could give you an example of an earlier presidential election where something completely unforeseen mattered a lot. And I'm not sure how many of you have seen the movie Big Miracle. It's about some whales trapped under the ice off the coast of Alaska. And that was in 1988. And so people got very enthusiastic watching television about having to free those whales from under the ice. And so a monumental effort was mobilized for that purpose, and everyone forgot about the presidential race. And ultimately, the Reagan administration became involved to some extent. Of course, others became involved. And ultimately, this mattered, something that perhaps shouldn't have mattered at all. I mean, whales do die under the ice sometimes. That's the terrible situation out in nature, but it turned out to matter a lot. And these days, I think for such an issue to become suddenly an overwhelmingly important issue is just more and more likely. To some extent, this is what we had with Emailgate. Of course, the specialty of that is that there it was this kind of unlikely issue, but it was also capitalized on by others. So that issue was used for the purpose of manipulation by various parties. And, something unforeseen like that would come in, and that's part of the structure of the events now. The unstructured is part of what is the structure of the events at the moment.
Are there any specialties for the elections procedures in Taiwan? Is it also personalizing as in the US?
I don't think so, at least not to that extent. So in Taiwan, the situation is quite different. The main question over there is always about cross-strait relations. And of course, right now I'm just speculating, but in a retrograde perspective, now it seems that the speech made by President Xi Jinping in January, I think 1st or 2nd of January, was kind of a self-defeating speech. As you may remember, Mr. Xi was talking about that the final goal of cross-strait relations is unification, and unification should be inevitable, and in case of any delay or any unforeseen situation, the use of force and violence cannot be ruled out, and it can even target other forces in the region, that is like the United States of America. And once again, in a retrospective point of view, it was quite surprising and quite self-defeating, because this speech took place a few months following a huge defeat of the DPP at the local elections in Taiwan. So the DPP, the incumbent power, was in retreat. It was in trouble. And then the People's Republic, the president made a speech what kind of reinvigorated anti-mainland or anti-communist feelings in Taiwan, and I think it pretty much helped the situation, especially from the point of view of Tsai Ing Wen. Of course, the elephant in the room was and is Hong Kong. It's no doubt that the situation in Hong Kong helped the most to Tsai Ing Wen to regain her popularity and finally to win the election at such a wide margin. So once again, she gained 57% against 38%. What Han Kuo-yu received as the candidate of the Kuomintang. And Hong Kong is still an issue there. Now it's a bit more lower profile, and because coronavirus is everywhere, so everyone talks about that one. But there will be new local elections in Hong Kong in September this year, and probably it will reignite these feelings and emotions in the island, I mean in Taiwan as well, and on the peninsula of Hong Kong as well. So Tsai Ing Wen is a very good position, and I think she rightfully made some comments and some remarks following the elections that the results of the elections are pure evidence that 23 million people of Taiwan, or at least the 14-point-something voters, those who voted, and the 88 million voters who voted on her, sent a crystal clear message to Beijing that they want to remain in the current situation, they want to maintain the status quo. So now she has a very strong legitimacy, domestic legitimacy.
See, as for India, could you give us a short guide to the largest vote in the world? Why did it take 6 weeks, for example?
So India votes in phases because we have 29 states, and it's obviously not possible for the election commission to mobilize that many people at the same time. So we vote in different phases, and the way that it's done is that there is a constitutional requirement for every person to be able to cast their vote, and for the state to make necessary arrangements for them. So there are stories of election officials needing to go to a remote area just to be able to reach one village which has 3 people. So you actually have somebody going up and setting up a voting booth in a place which is incredibly remote, in a jungle somewhere, and setting up a voting booth just for these people to be able to exercise their vote. But what this sort of does is that it extends the period across which campaigning can happen to a certain extent, and there's a sort of malleability to the way that public opinion is shaped even in the course of the elections. And this is something that we saw, which was emerging, especially in 2019, where we saw that there was an increasing presidentialization of what are essentially parliamentary elections. So you had people voting for Narendra Modi as the face of the Bharatiya Janata Party, instead of voting for their local candidate. And this is something which we're seeing across the world in parliamentary democracies, where politics is becoming increasingly personalized and is not being tied to a party anymore. And to a certain extent, of course, the nature of the problem in India is very different from Taiwan and the US. But what that effectively does is that in case of a fractured opposition, which is what we have in India, a fractured opposition which is mostly a lot of the time in retreat, we see that even though there are state level victories which are possible, because the electorate is mature enough to be able to distinguish national elections and state elections, they're unable to mold or make a necessary connection between what is a national issue and what is a local issue, as when a general election is happening. So what happened in India is that the opposition did not put up a prime ministerial candidate, and what that led to is Narendra Modi being able to take the leader of the opposition, the main leader of the opposition party, who is a dynastic politician called Rahul Gandhi. He was able to take, and Rahul Gandhi is somebody who is the butt of jokes everywhere, and he's a dynastic politician. He still somehow, even at the tender age of 47, refers to himself as a young politician. So Modi was able to take the lack of an opposition face and then cast all of these electoral ambitions onto him by but just because of the fact that the opposition, even though there was some degree of unity among opposition, they had decided to not put up a prime ministerial face or a prime ministerial candidate against Narendra Modi at the stage of the election, and therefore they were able, and Modi was able to use this to cast all of these allegations against Rahul Gandhi, even though he was not going to be the eventual face of the opposition or their prime ministerial candidate in all likelihood if they won, which is unlikely. So that is something that sort of helped the BJP stave off some of the problems they were facing in state level elections, where there is a credible face to the opposition in a lot of these places.
I see. So India's Prime Minister and also the President of Taiwan for the second term, President Trump is running for re-election. You have all mentioned factors that have enhanced their chances of getting re-elected. What other factors have enhanced or hampered their chances? For example, the China card. In theory, in all three countries, parties in opposition or in government could use the China card for their purposes. Has it happened, for example, in Taiwan?
Yeah, sure. But in Taiwan, probably there is one big card, and there's the China card, as I just mentioned before. That cross-strait relations are the major factor to influence politicians and political decisions in the country. So, of course, during the presidential campaign and the debates, it was the most important topic. Just to make you understand how important it was, that the low support of Tsai Ing Wen before 2019, so in 2018 and early 2019, was mostly due to her quite poor performance in domestic politics, the way she handled the economy, the labor reform, and other domestic issues. Through those, she managed to make her support crumble all around the country. And it was only one thing, and that was China, what helped her to regain support, public support all around the country. So that's why I tried to at least allude a few minutes ago to the fact that the speech made by Xi Jinping helped her pretty much. So, of course, I'm just speculating, but given the fact that we know that the People's Republic of China knows Taiwan very well, they know everything what's happening over there. They're spying everything over there. So I'm just wondering whether the speech made by Xi Jinping had a secondary purpose. Maybe they wanted to reinforce the DPP. Of course, once again, I'm just speculating, and it's a bit kind of a science fiction. But it just simply doesn't make sense from my point of view that if the DPP is weak, and China is interested in making a DPP weaker, why would Xi Jinping, make a speech what would help the DPP on the long run? So that's kind of a conundrum. Of course, we will never learn what the real purpose of Xi Jinping was over there. And whatever it was definitely taken over by the problems, first of all, Hong Kong, and then the coronavirus today. But anyway, I think that, and again, getting back to personalities, of course personalities matter, especially in political environments, in political systems, where we definitely vote on a person. Even in Hungary, theoretically, we do not vote on the prime minister or the candidates, prime minister candidates, but we vote on the parties and local candidates. But in systems like America or like Taiwan, where we do vote on personalities, super important. And whether it's a new phenomenon or not, I'm not sure. I think it's still true that in America, it's always the taller presidential candidate who wins eventually. And if I'm not mistaken, it's still true. So if you think about JFK, if you think about Ronald Reagan, personality was always very important. And if we stick to this idea that personality is very important, I feel very sorry for the American voters that they do find Donald Trump as an appealing candidate.
Speaking of the American elections, how important it is today to weaponize China?
To weaponize China? Actually, there's not such a huge gap between Democrats and Republicans on China. So when the whole trade war thing started, there wasn't actually an outcry in protest by Democrats. Quite the contrary, in fact. Nancy Pelosi was very supportive of such measures and found them timely as well. Of course, there are nuances to this that are interesting to talk about. Of course, to US measures, China responded. And China responded in such ways as to target specific US interest groups in specific states so that they might exert an effect on those in power. And so they were targeting specifically Republican states, for example, and interest groups closer to the Republicans thereby. So in this sense, there's some domestic politics to the issue, and there's some difference between the policy platform of various Democratic candidates. Joe Biden's relatively softer on China, but this is in relative terms, and I think it's mostly an elite consensus in the U.S. now that they have to put the whole Sino-U.S. relationship on a different footing. The economic interaction aspect of it, as well as the military security-related aspects, given China's assertive behavior in various regions. And so there's this re-evaluation that will be happening even under a different president. We're most likely not going to have a different president. I feel confident to make that prediction now because obviously it carries no stakes for me if I'm wrong. And let's remember that, of course, I can be wrong because if you think back to 2016, even a very noteworthy gentleman by the name Vladimir Putin thought that Hillary Clinton would win those elections as late as in September 2016. So, everyone assumed that that would be happening, and then it ultimately didn't happen. Now everyone's assuming that Trump's very likely, in fact, because he has the economy in his favor, and that obviously stands to be a very important issue in determining the outcome of the elections. But whether this would make a big difference in terms of China policy, who ultimately really wins, I have my doubts. The nuances, yeah, but the overall direction is not really that shaky in my mind.
If I could interject, I was just curious about where you see the Huawei thing going, the prosecution.
Well, obviously there are major issues involved in that case as well. It's not going to go away. It's going to remain a national security concern wherever Huawei is involved and however it is involved. It's going to be an issue for UK-US relations even. Yeah. It's going to be a big issue there. Considering the new position that the UK finds itself in international politics, it's going to be interesting to follow that as well. And under a Democratic president, would that be different? I doubt that.
In India, what were the main topics during the campaign? Pakistan, for example?
It's hard to conduct. No, it's actually not really. India barely features in Pakistan's elections, but somehow Pakistan features quite heavily in. But there are four things I want to broadly talk about here. One is the fact that because you asked about what were the sort of the broad trends. One of the things that is very important to talk about, and I think that this is something we should be talking about, which is election financing, and this is something that the Modi government had really pushed very big on when it was taking on the previous government on the issue of campaign finance reform and the fact that there was excessive amounts of black money, which is the way illicit funds are referred to in India, and the way that political parties are financed in India. And what the BJP did is that they introduced seemingly anonymized electoral bonds, which only the end users would be able to identify, and they were able to push this measure through about 5 months before the elections. Now, recent data which has emerged has shown that about 93% of all of the bonds which were sold in the period between the introduction of the bonds and the start of the election went to the BJP, and that is approximately 3,500 crores. I'm not sure how much that is in millions of euros, but it goes up to the millions of euros. So it's impossible to talk about these results without looking at the broader story of democratic deconsolidation and the fact that there has been a steady erosion in Indian institutions and the way that they respond to government pressure. And we're increasingly seeing that the Election Commission of India did not crack down on the fact that a foreign policy issue which traditionally has usually not featured in electoral discourse. The way that this played out is that in India, according to Indian law, you cannot invoke the army to seek votes, and this is something that Mr. Modi did in the course of, and the Election Commission did not respond in any meaningful way, and even if they did, it came very, very late. And of course, there were, so it's impossible to talk about the Indian election story without thinking about the institutional consequences which have come about in the course of 2014 to 2019. And the most important thing, I think, which we also need to talk about is the steady campaign of disinformation and fake news, which has it's less of a problem in terms of a foreign power, because it's not a foreign power that does it. It's actually the government in power that is in fact pushing through this insidious forms of messaging, which removes the political, and it's sort of direct form of communication between the constituent and what seems like the political party. And you also have this labeling of opponents and political opponents as enemy of the state, and you're referring to people who are your political opponents as anti-national. And of course, this feeds into the classic sort of definitions of what a populist is, and this is something that we have been seeing constantly in India, especially in the run-up to the 2018 elections.
How would you describe the leaders of Taiwan and the United States? Can they be labeled as populists in Taiwan?
I don't think so. I don't think that Tsai Ing Wen fills the classical standards of a populist leader. Some even say that her counterpart, Hong Yu, was a more populistic person on the side of the KMT, and his personality was something what you would describe as a populist, or at least someone closer to that side of the political spectrum. Of course, those who oppose the policies of Tsai Ing Wen, they say that she has some populist attitude. Some even claim that she governed the party before she stepped down last year as a little dictator. But I think if you want to be a leading politician, you have to be strict, especially if you're a lady in an Asian environment. We shouldn't forget that she's the very first female president in whole East Asia in the history, so I guess that it takes some bollocks to lead the country like that.
Fake news and foreign invention in the election?
And that's a very important topic. I had the pleasure to visit Taiwan last December, so a few weeks before the elections, and we had a talk with the Mainland Affairs Council's Deputy Minister, and he said that the most important issue the country had to tackle with was the rise of Chinese, according to their sources, Chinese influence in the country, especially internet influence, so trolls, fake news, websites, and all of these classical methods China learned from Russia, mostly, as they say. But I was quite impressed by the methods, the countermeasures employed by Taiwan. So, for example, every single state agency and authority is obliged today to react to any fake news on Taiwanese internet in a matter of hours. And they have to react in the same way. So if the fake news, what is more and more popular today, is spreading in form of a meme, or a picture, or a graph, or anything like that, the state authorities are entitled to react in the same form. So also in a meme, in a graph, in a picture, in a cartoon, whatever, because they just realize that the people do pay more attention to those pictures, graphs, and whatever, so it's better to address fake news and to use countermeasures similar to the original source of fake news.
So they were successful in creating public awareness to the problem?
I think so. I think so. Of course, it's really hard to measure because if you ask people in a public opinion survey that, do you believe fake news? Of course, everyone would reply that, no, I don't. So it's a challenge, really hard to assess. We don't know what we know and we don't know what we don't know, as the classical saying goes. But I think that they are doing a lot because if there is a country targeted by China, it's Taiwan. Not a country, sorry, a region, an island or whatever, a population.
In the United States, are there any measures taken to prevent foreign intervention in the election?
I thought you meant to ask the question about whether Trump's a populist.
I can ask that question, but it seems a bit naive question.
So you have an answer for that?
Yes.
Care to share it with us?
Yes, he can be labeled as a populist leader. And as for the use of fake news and foreign intervention in the election,
well, it's going to happen, obviously.
And are there any measures taken to prevent it? Or they settle in the situation?
It's a tricky thing, because it's obviously in the eye of the beholder what you regard as manipulation. So to act against it is highly problematic. And to some extent, I want to present a nuanced assessment of this, but to some extent, you would be right to say that it's mostly the Republican side that is bound to be affected by fake news, their constituency. I mean, this is the empirical record from the last election that, I mean, if you have a hard time deciding whether this is true or if this is just a partisan kind of truth, think of what happened in Macedonia. There was this small little town in Macedonia, population of which, significant share of the population of which, basically made an industry out of producing fake news for the US market. And they made big money on that. And guess what? Guess what part of the US electorate they focused on with their fake news movement? And for them it was a business decision. For them it wasn't a partisan decision. For them it paid in terms of money that they focused on the Republican side more, because the Republican side was just so much easier to target and to get those people to click on clickbaits. It was just much more effective, and so that's what they chose to do. So yeah, this is going to be around definitely. I think it's going to appear in the messaging of even the actors involved around the election. So you may be aware of this, that in the US elections, super PACs play an important role, which committees basically funding political messaging independently of the presidential candidates. So they are like totally not coordinating with the candidates that they support. They're just independently doing stuff. Yeah. And so everyone knows that obviously there is some level of coordination usually. And so these super PACs will often be looking to enhance such messages. But it's a very political issue. How can you act against this systematically if by acting against this, you can be portrayed as just playing politics, being partisan. So it's very hard to tackle that. While Obama was still president in his last year in office, of course this was a big issue and they realized what's going on, but they had to wait for a really long time to try to make news out of this and to try to take steps against this. And when it was clear that Russia is really systematically involved in trying to interfere in the elections, and they ultimately got around to warning Russia about this. By that time, it was arguably way too late because the Russians were already significantly influencing the US electoral process through the hacking of the Democratic National Convention, email accounts belonging to significant democratic figures and their advisors, including John Podesta, important advisor there. I mean, by that time, the emails were stolen and they were making the news constantly. And these were released in waves, and the waves were timed very carefully to basically put whatever the Obama administration did against this under the radar. So when the Obama administration decided to warn Russia, just at that time, you had the second big wave of releases coming. And it completely blinded much of the US electorate to what the Obama administration was trying to warn about regarding Russia. And this time around, it's, well, let me conclude the analysis by pointing out the obvious. It's a different president.
If we talk about the effects of personalities, populism, fake news, we should mention the social division in these countries. What are the bases, what are the lines today for those divisions? For example, in India, ideology, caste system.
India's
Level.
at the national level. Yeah, it's driven by a number of different kinds of differences and polarizations. So you have differentiation on the basis of religion, caste, and kinship. And what's interesting is that while many countries have sort of been waking up to this idea of doing identity politics fairly late, and this idea of doing identity politics as opposed to class politics. Identity politics is something that has been absolutely central to India for an extremely long time, and because there's been a lot of evidence to indicate that people vote along caste, religion, and kinship lines. So you're basically, and this happens, I think, in electorates with low levels of political information and low levels of maturity, where you, in a village, you're basically told who you're going to vote for by your caste head or your kin head. So it's sort of like so this idea that identity politics is something that has been happening in India for a very long time, but the BJP, when it came to power, especially in its first term, did not pursue very ostensibly an ideology of ethno-religious nationalism, which it is completely able to do in its second term. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But it's done three things, which has completely, it's polarized the electorate even more. Which is, the first is the fact that it criminalized a certain way of divorce amongst Muslims. So usually you would be able to just say a triple talaq, which is just communicate to your spouse that you want a divorce, and but they basically said that this will now carry criminal consequences in a move which is widely seen as being symbolic against Muslim communities and especially Muslim men. The second was, of course, the issue of Kashmir and what happened with the abrogation of special status. And the third, of course, is the newly enacted citizenship law, which has again greatly polarized the electorate pretty much along religious lines. We also see something of a rural-urban divide in some parts of the country, but this is not very clearly fleshed out. It's not something that we can draw very clear conclusions on at the moment.
So far, the legitimacy from last year, has it resulted in a stronger ethno-nationalist agenda for Modi? Yes. So of course, I mean, this is speculation. This is, of course, so since economic deregulation and was something that what the BJP had promised in its first term and was not complete, did not do at all. What I believe that they are trying to distract from is the fact that the Indian economy is doing very, very poorly, and now there is now they have a very solid supermajority in parliament, and this has led to two particular things, which is the fact that we now have a citizenship law which explicitly states that everybody who is non-Muslim from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan would have a preference for Indian citizenship, and that clearly goes against the grain of the fact that India is a secular country. And the second is the fact that
that the government took away the autonomous status of Kashmir, which was the only Muslim majority state in India, in last August, and this, I think these two have bolstered the opinion that there is a clear vein of strong ethno-religious nationalism which we will see over the course of this particular term.
In Taiwan, what are the bases of political polarization? Do they follow party affiliation or less so as in India?
So when it comes to the elections of the results, so let's skip the previous elections and the local elections, but the presidential elections we see two kind of division. The less important one is spatial division. So it seems that the eastern parts of the country, with lower population density, technically the rural areas, are more KMT. So there, the majority of the voters opted on voting on KMT, including the two small islands close to the mainland, like Kálmán. And when it comes to the western part, so closer to the mainland and the urban regions, at least at the presidential elections, they mostly voted on the DPP and Tsai Ing Wen herself. What is more important is generational differences in the country. So to put it very simply, younger people tend to be more anti-mainland, more DPP. Older people, or mid-age and older people, so above 40 and 50, they tend to vote more on KMT and on some kind of cooperation with the mainland. And that puts the KMT in a very severe situation today. So the KMT is going through an internal struggle nowadays because they have to react somehow to the new demographic situation. And they have to say something more concrete about what they think about the relationship with the mainland. Because in the past few months, or during the past year actually, Tsai Ing Wen regained her popularity mostly because her statements about the mainland and the message of Xi Jinping were all very, very strict, very anti-Chinese, very not pro-independence, but pro-status quo. And compared to that, KMT couldn't really say anything very different. So KMT now is at the risk of losing its profile, its political profile. They have nothing else to say what DPP does when it comes to China. And domestic politics are less important to the people, and when it comes to domestic politics and policies, the difference between the two parties are even less or even weaker. So KMT is now in a big trouble. Some younger members of the KMT are now pushing the party towards some kind of rejuvenation, if you like. Some even say that the name China, so Chinese KMT or Chinese National Party, the term China should be erased from the name of the party to give a new profile to their political aim or political agenda.
In the United States, the electorate is divided.
I just had a question.
Of course.
Are there any other parties apart from these two? Are there any subnational parties in Taiwan?
Not subnational parties, there are some more. So altogether four parties could have launched a presidential campaign. Finally, three parties launched a campaign. Every party over 5% of support at the previous election has the right or is entitled to launch the campaign. So it's a little bit like the British political spectrum. But there are two major parties and some small, actually quite irrelevant ones.
In the United States, Professor Natura mentioned the generation gap. Does it consider a factor in the division in the United States?
Yes, some are trying to calculate with that, and there are some polls indicating that with the millennials, that they call as such, President Trump is not so strong. So he's hovering around, well, somewhere between 30 and 40%. Definitely doesn't have anything approaching a majority there. It's clearly in the minority there within that particular generational segment. it was interesting to find out that apparently millennials counted include people up to the age of 34. So yeah, you're not so far from there. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's obviously a little wider than perhaps what people typically associate with the category millennial in everyday usage. So it's an actually more significant segment than just what you would think of as millennials as such. And there Trump doesn't do well enough. Well, apparently young people are less fond of the wall along the border with Mexico, and they are less fond also of the chance to buy weapons of all kinds, including weapons that can be easily reconfigured to become assault rifles in the bad hands. And so gun control would be something that this generational segment would generally appreciate. I mean, the majority within that segment. So on these issues, it's very hard to see how Trump could possibly change his position, because these speak very strongly to his constituency. But obviously, because this has been identified as one outstanding issue for the Republicans as to where they have to mobilize more support, they're going to take steps, and obviously they'll try to find some issues where perhaps they can, chip away from the Democrats' advantage in that respect. And a similar outstanding issue concerns the case of Black Americans. There as well, it's even more pronounced, Trump's disadvantage there. He has like less than 10% support there. And so now he's focusing quite a lot on trying to improve his position there. So obviously steps are going to be taken, and we might ultimately see a more even race as a result in that generational segment, but for now, it stands to go in favor of the Democrats more than the Republicans.
Is there a topic in which every generation is interested in the US? For example, the income inequality? Absolutely.
I mean, of course, in various ways. And some would say, you talk about income inequality, you're engaging in class war. That's a perspective that exists out there in the wild. And there's other perspectives too. And so this brings up, for instance, the issue of healthcare, which is obviously important for everyone in, again, various different ways. So how people relate to the to Obamacare, as it's more popularly known, to programs such as Medicaid and Medicare, and how coverage should be extended or not, with what conditions. This is something that even the Democratic candidates have some debates about between themselves, but obviously there's a very different Republican perspective on this. So, I'm just saying, by the way, the United States, just like other countries, is committed to get to universal health coverage by 2030, but of course what you count as universal health coverage is something that can differ in different people's minds. So obviously this is not necessarily informing the debate as a major factor. I'm just pointing it out as an aside, as an interesting aside, basically. But many are not in favor of extending the benefits of Medicaid and Medicare further. Some would even try to roll back some things. So yeah, it's going to be a major issue for debate, and it's going to be interesting for everyone involved. I've just spoken last year to a person from the US who lives in Hungary at the moment, and what this person mentioned to me was that I'm going to avoid reference to gender because I don't want to give away information about the person. So that this person came to Hungary because, otherwise this person would be just one step away from, one disease away from financial bankruptcy. And it's sort of better to be over here where, you enjoy possibly better access to healthcare. And I'm not talking about someone who's necessarily from marginalized segments of US society. So for young people, it's enormously important that health insurance is something that, is a major issue if you want to consider your prospects and your financial prospects, and your health prospects. So all these are said to be important for young people. Might be surprised, older people usually could be expected to think more about these things, but I mean it's a major issue for the youngest voters as well.
In almost 3 countries, proclaiming to be a democracy is an important element for national self-identification. Is the democratic process, for example in India, stable? The public perception is in favor of democracy, or are they leaning with the more authoritarian ways?
Well, I think the overall support for democracy exists, and I think that India is just too large, and it has too many internal divisions for it to be united against or united in favor of a benevolent dictator of any sort. So I would say that the prospects for democracy in India are good in some sense, but of course, as I was saying earlier, you can't view that in isolation from the fact that there has been massive institutional failures on the part of our courts to effectively respond to political actors, and as well as third-party institutions. So these institutions of diagonal accountability, such as the Ombudsman or the Election Commission, they've not really responded to embolden political actors in any meaningful way. So while the prospect for democracy is good, simply because India is just too large for it to be under the sway of one party, and especially since there is actually a huge disparity between the north and the south. So we have a poorer north and a poorer, more populous north, a richer, less populous south, which in effect, even in financial terms, in some senses, subsidizes. There's a cross subsidy going on there. So the South has never been big with the BJP. It has failed to make inroads into the South in any very meaningful ways. So I would say that yes, the prospects are good, because we are also seeing a wave of protests across India, across the new citizenship laws and they're using language of the Constitution and of constitutional rights. So that is very heartening to see. And I was in India in December. I've taken part in many of these protests, and so it's been heartening to see that there have been these protests. And just yesterday there were state elections in Delhi where the BJP lost pretty badly. So while these are again state elections, they portend fairly well for subnational parties, but in order for the opposition to be able to stitch together a credible narrative, there needs to be a lot of work done.
In Taiwan, the China pressure, the increasing diplomatic isolation, does that facilitate the electorate active participation in the political process?
The turnout at the last presidential election was very close to 75%, what was the highest since 2008. So I think it's quite clear that the overwhelming majority of the Taiwanese electorate really likes to go to vote. I'm not sure whether we in Hungary ever had such a high turnout since 1990. Maybe the very first elections in 1990, but ever since we are very happy to have 60 or 60-something% of the people cast their ballots. So whether it's external pressure, probably, of course, China plays some role in that. And it's also important that the division between the society is getting intenser and getting bigger because of the decision whether to get closer to the mainland or to pursue independence or at least a higher level of separation from the mainland.
I see. In the United States, the voter turnout is average around what percent? Can you tell us?
About 60 for the presidentials. I mean, there's been a period where it was slightly lower, and there were some concerns that this itself is a crisis, but I mean, it rebounded from there, partly because of the polarization that's in a sense contributing to voter mobilization, obviously. It's going to be always lower for congressional elections, voter turnout typically. I mean, it's one aspect of U.S. democracy. I mean, otherwise, you know, the U.S. has a vibrant civil society, and in that sense, participation in politics is, you know, quite active. Could be better, in fact, than what you would think based on just voter turnout, but that's where the issue is at right now.
If you look at the general trends, there are competing notions and examples for democracy in Asia. The US example is one. In India, does it proclaim to have a specific kind of democracy, or it follows the European example, the US example?
We have a first past the post system, so I mean in terms of, so I don't really know what you mean when you say a model of democracy, so it's strictly first past the post, and it's a winner takes all kind of system, which, I mean, it doesn't work very well in many cases. It leads to gaming of the system by well-placed actors. But if you could just refine what you mean by that exactly, like, then maybe I have a stronger idea.
Either seeking to establish a separate model for democracy, like in China. In rhetoric, they increasingly use terms used in liberal, self-proclaimed liberal democracies. In India, are there any inventions to the already existing models of democracy, or?
I mean, you probably don't have a version of what Orban does with the liberal democracy here. So no, there isn't a unique or like you know, socialism with Chinese characteristics or something like that. No, it's weird. It still goes by the fact that it's a sovereign, socialist, secular republic, which are the words in our preamble. So and I think that there's been no. I mean, you know how the conversation around democratic norms and conventions proceeds in the U.S. and you know how there's been a breakdown in the norms of political civility and other kinds of political norms which have broken down. These guys seem to play, at least rhetorically, by the rules. So there's no attempt to remodel it in a very large-scale sense. But of course, there's chipping away in many different senses, all of which we've touched upon, I think.
Let's see. Okay, my last question before the Q&A. Are there any long-term strategic consequences in these elections we were talked about? For example, in Taiwan, reinforcing the status quo is a...
I was just wondering, are there any long-term consequences of the U.S. presidential elections?
Usually there
Yeah,
are.
usually, okay. But in Taiwan, well, it really depends how China reacts to this situation. And Taiwan, I think, is now a bit lucky, however morbid it is, because of Hong Kong and because of the coronavirus. So Beijing is preoccupied with solving these issues. Once again, we are not certain how Xi Jinping will react to this or would react to this as soon as the coronavirus issue is over in China. Some say that in the recent months or the second half of the last year, China was already aware of what was going on and they just tried to manage the situation further. Some people who are more pessimistic, they say that it's part of the personal agenda of Xi Jinping to speed up the reunification process, and he follows a very different strategy from what Deng Xiaoping back in the good old times said, that the Taiwan issue will be solved somewhere in the future by the next generation. If Xi Jinping really believes that he is the next generation to solve the situation, we can see a major problem in the region. But generally speaking, all the Taiwanese people, experts, soldiers and politicians I talked to last December, they all agree that they don't expect a Chinese offensive against Taiwan. It just simply does not work at all. It would be a disaster to China itself. And if you, maybe a year ago, I also read a Chinese article, a Chinese foreign policy expert contemplated on okay, but what if we take Taiwan? Today, probably China would be able to invade and successfully conquer Taiwan despite all US efforts. But this very article boiled down to the conclusion that, okay, we take it, and then what? What are we doing to do with an island of 34 million people who hate us? He drew conclusions from American experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan and here and there, that to just roll over the military of your enemy is one thing, but to keep that territory in your hands and to do something with local insurgency is a very different thing, especially in the case of Taiwan, where, unlike in Afghanistan or in Iraq, American soldiers were facing non-American adversaries, but here Chinese people would be in front of other Chinese people, Taiwanese Chinese people, and even Xi Jinping himself told once that we don't want to kill our compatriots. So I didn't really expect any major turn in the Taiwan policy of Beijing either.
May I ask you whether you've seen analyses that tell you that China could take Taiwan in spite of the efforts of the United States?
Actually, we visited the National Defense Institution, and Taiwanese soldiers informed us that the RAND Corporation, I think it ran 19 simulations of China's invasion of Taiwan and American intervention, and in all 19 cases the US lost. Of course, you need to employ some proper source criticism, and of course we might think that RAND Corporation and the American military wants to have more money, therefore they run simulations where they always fail, and therefore they can claim that we need more money to protect Taiwan. But generally speaking, in the past decade, China, the People's Republic, has developed quite substantial forces, especially in the fields of power projection capability and what's the word for that? To send missions over the sea, and to landing crafts, hovercrafts, and parachuters and stuff like that. And the US forces in the region are not that strong as of today. The Chinese possess weapons to take out Guam in case of necessity. But you never know. I don't want to see that happen. So.
Well, certainly I wouldn't either. But I would be somewhat skeptical of those scenarios, if you ask me.
Of course, it really depends on the date or the year. So when? Are we talking about tomorrow or in 5 years, 10 years? Let me put it this way, that in 10 years, the risk to be taken by the United States would be significantly higher.
Absolutely. The context matters a lot. Who happen to be the leaders involved on the various sides. In this respect, to answer your question, so this is not actually such a big detour from the question you were originally asking. I'm tending to revise now a little bit my position about there not being a major difference in terms of who becomes president. At least a Bernie Sanders presidency would obviously make some difference. I wouldn't, want to exaggerate this in advance, because it's the experience time and again that just because of a change in the person of the president, it's not really everything that would change at the same time. There's an establishment in place, there are institutions in place, there are commitments in place, and so it's not like changing from one day to the other, everything, if suddenly there's a different person in the White House. But certainly Bernie Sanders, if you're looking at his positions, his making statements that basically there's no place for US troops overseas, they should be brought back home, no need for major overseas military commitments, decrease the budget for the US military, the US defense budget. And obviously as a matter of how much he's able to pursue such ambitions once he's president, that could potentially make a difference. Right now, if you're looking at the progressive wing of the Democratic Party as a third factor in this respect, it's to some extent a race between Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And the latest Democratic primaries show Sanders gaining an edge on Elizabeth Warren. But of course, the race is not only for the vote of the, so to say, progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but also, of course, the entire party has to be behind the candidate eventually. And of course, there are others too. And so this is a race. But as far as that particular faction is concerned, it seems likely that Sanders counts a little more now than Elizabeth Warren in this respect. But Warren has similar positions on, bringing troops home, decreasing the military budget, stuff like that.
And just to second your point, just think about Donald Trump. That 4 years ago, everyone was talking about the doomsday scenario should he be elected, and despite his very, very strong rhetoric, the actual actions and domestic policies of the United States have not changed that tremendously.
Of course, the difference being that he didn't really talk about major cutbacks to the military budget.
Yeah, sure.
So, because with a view to his constituency, that wouldn't have made sense. But yeah, to some extent, there's an obvious similarity there. I agree.
Like a mirror.
Yeah, I do think these elections have great significance, because I think that in the follow-up to the election, we've seen, as I was saying, we've seen a very strong brand of ethno-religious nationalism, which has taken a policy form as well. And I think that what is interesting is that there has been a response from Indian civil society in the form of protests which have been going on every day. So there are on average about 300 protests every day across the country, and there has never been this extent of student mobilization, as well as multi-partisan affiliation against a particular measure. So I think the most important consequence of these elections is going to be social, in the sense that there's going to be a battle for defining what it means to be Indian. And I think that since the BJP has taken these measures to try and redefine what it means to be Indian somewhat along religious lines, I do think that this has a great potential to be a game changer in many senses. And the second thing which I want to talk about is the institutional story, which is that we've seen a decay of institutions across the board. But what's more worrying is the fact that we've seen a decay in forms of discursive accountability, in terms of the way that the media holds people in power to account. And I think that over the last 5 or 6 years, there has been greater governmental interference in national media across print as well as electronic forms. And I think the long-lasting effects of that and disinformation are going to be very hard to undo. So,
in terms of foreign policy, do you see long-term effect?
I don't think there's going to be any sort of long-term because we're seeing that Narendra Modi is portrayed as having a more muscular stance to certain issues, but I think there's been a great degree of continuity with respect to most issues. And even with Pakistan, there is some degree of continuity, except for when there has been direct provocation and responses, but there's mostly continuity.
Thank you very much to you all. Now I'd like to open the floor to questions, remarks, comments from the audience. Please raise your hand. Viewers, yes, please.
Yeah, okay, so thank you for sharing your thoughts with us here. And I have one question each country. First of all, with Taiwan, and sorry for my question to being reaching back to historical times, but how does the Taiwanese people felt when at 1971 in the UN, the Chinese People's Republic changed the seat? I mean, they replaced the nationalist Taiwanese Chinese in the UN.
Very sad.
Yeah. Okay.
What did you expect? So
Yeah. So right now, is this the part of the big China card as well? Still, is it still around? This sadness.
how do you mean that? Like
I
what
mean,
happened 50
you
years
said
ago?
that there's a big card in Taiwanese politics, which is the China card.
Yeah, sure.
And is it part of that card? Is it usually brought up even nowadays?
No, I don't think so. I think the China card means that how to handle the situation between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, whether to get closer, to cooperate more tightly with the People's Republic, or to pursue more independence or the independence, or to find a middle ground like a status quo. But I don't think that the situation in the UN is a major issue. It's an issue whether Taiwan can join certain international institutions, like nowadays they talk about that it's such a pity that Taiwan cannot be a member of the WHO because of the coronavirus. It's been on the agenda for a while that Taiwan would like to join the International Aviation Association or whatever, because of its importance in international flights. So these institutions, of course, are part of the agenda, but the United Nations itself, I don't think so. It is an important issue that Taiwan has been losing more and more diplomatic allies. 3 in a row in the last year, what is a clear sign of the increasing pressure of Beijing over Taiwan. It has some geopolitical consequences as well, especially when it comes to the Solomon Islands and also to Kiribati. And it's also a very sad moment when, in every public institution in Taiwan, you see the flags of diplomatic allies. And I can only imagine what a sad situation it might be when someone has to be called at, like the janitor that's, hey, Mr. Wong, could you please take away one another flag again? Again? Oh my God, again. Third time this year. So, of course, nobody's happy about that.
To add something to this, getting back to the issue of the WHO and the politics around that, with the coronavirus epidemic, you may have heard in the news that the nCoV, the novel coronavirus, was named now officially SARS-CoV-2 by the International Committee on Virus Taxonomy. Taiwan is protesting that. They say they're not going to take the new name. They're going to insist on calling it Wuhan virus. Okay, so there's a message there.
Yes. Yeah, next one, America. I really like having issues with forming a question about that because so much going on right now. We had just the Iowa caucus, and how do you see which Democratic candidate was strengthened by this error in the system? Was it still Pete Buttigieg or even in the Democratic aisle, the radical Bernie Sanders, or not radical, but Bernie Sanders, or Elizabeth Warren, or Joe Biden still has a chance to come back?
Yeah, you never know. I mean, Biden is definitely determined to stay in the race, and he's pointed out that this is just beginning. But as I said, his financial situation in particular is a little concerning. If I am him, then I would be concerned right now. But always certain things could change equations a little. But getting back to the question of whether the Iowa caucus made a decisive mark on the process, I doubt that. I mean, it was rather important in terms of sending a rather awkward message about the Democratic primaries in general. So it definitely didn't help the Democrats that they started off like that. The signs of disorganization, everyone's looking at, is Russia going to do it again? Are they going to hack someone? Are they going to get involved? And then you use a stupid app that makes a mask for you without the Russians. It doesn't help, obviously. So you can basically do this to yourself, shoot yourself in the leg, doesn't help. I mean, for now it's too early to call. Sanders has an edge, as I said, as far as his own specific constituency is concerned, but as to the overall Democratic Party, it's fairly even between him and Buttigieg. And you know, if Bloomberg joins the race with a lot of money, obviously, and he actually maintained his reserves, not joining the race early on, only joining it at a later point. So that may turn out to be a clever move, ultimately. So we'll have to see. I mean, at this point, it's just too early to call it. At the earliest, after the Super Tuesday in March, you might be a little smarter, perhaps, as to who has a more decisive edge over all of the others. For now, it's very fragmented, but possibly it could go right up to the convention's time, and it could still be contested. So, yeah, at this point, I would be very cautious. Even though it carries no stakes for me, as I pointed out, I wouldn't want to make, such a bet, because it just doesn't make sense at this point, really.
Sorry, I just one more question about America. How do you see, during electing the Democratic nominee, what is the role of CNN? Because as my perception, they really picky about, sometimes they are endorsing Bernie Sanders, sometimes they are changing the tone about, and how do you see that?
Well, I mean, CNN is mainstream media. It wants to behave as such, but it exists in a very polarized media universe, where the roles are assigned partly independently of the will of the individual media organizations concerned. So Republicans don't look very kindly to CNN, and CNN inevitably in the US has a predominantly Democratic audience. And so, of course, the debates on CNN are going to reflect to some extent the internal debates of the Democratic side. At least that's my impression. It's not a quantitative assessment. This is how it comes across to me. And in this sense, that you would hear all kinds of positions is a result of that. You won't hear a strong pro-Trump voice on CNN, most likely. But you will hear different voices, diverse voices, as far as the debates between Democrats are concerned.
Thank you much. And the final question about India. Sorry, bringing again, as my perception, when there was the revoking the autonomous status of Jammu and Kashmir state, of course, outside Kashmir, I couldn't really see big, widespread protests around the country. Because in Jammu and Kashmir itself there was a lot of police and military to crack those down. But right now, about these citizenship amendment bills and these different kind of laws, I see these big widespread protests, what maybe should have happened during summer, after August 5th. How do you see that, and why do you think that right now these citizenship amendment bills could mobilize the widespread Indian population?
I don't know, to be honest. So I don't know what it is that wakes up a certain section of the populace over another. I think mostly because of the fact that you can't see the Citizenship Amendment Bill Act now in isolation from the National Population Register. So just to give you a brief background of what this is, there's this widespread assumption in India that center of left political parties benefit from illegal migration from Bangladesh, and because of the easy availability of elector cards and voter cards, they can reap dividends by having lax border policies. So the way that the BJP portrays this is to say that we need to chuck out these illegal immigrants. Not, they don't say chuck out, we'll actually house them in detention camps, which is what they do. So, so there is this discourse about illegal immigrants, but primarily Muslim illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. So, so the way that this, I think what happened is again, this is speculation, but I think that there is this idea that the National Population Register, which is this exercise to identify who are illegal immigrants and who are valid citizens, will actually, within its catchment, also catch poor people who may or may not have documents to prove that they came to India at a certain point of time. Because it's also true that only about 4 to 5% of the Indian population broadly has documents and identity papers which can verify citizenship. So one, of course, is the fact that this could be seen as a last straw, which I don't think it is. It's in no way is it sort of as last straw. I think the BJP will go further, but I think the fact that it would stand to affect a wider section of the populace than just the people in Kashmir. Of course, I mean, this is not helped by the fact that the Kashmir issue is so polarizing that even parties which are not on the radical right in India, such as the BJP, also supported the revocation of special status for Kashmir. So, you know, this is sort of this manufacturing of this organized consensus around Kashmir and about the fact that not having them have special status was a good thing. So there's greater unanimity around the Kashmir issue than there is around the fact that there would be a broader section of the Indian populace who would be affected by it. These are just speculation, but I don't know is the real answer.
Thank you for all.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Thank you for coming tonight. You all mentioned quite many times the coronavirus. Can you please reflect on how your countries of tonight reacted to the coronavirus? I know there was some conflict between Taiwan and China and the US and China. I don't know much about India. I just know there are 3 cases in India, which is not a lot. Can you give some comment on this?
I have no idea. I cannot respond to this question because I really don't know. Okay. So
sorry, I didn't pay attention to that part of cross-strait relations. But there are new coronavirus infections in Thailand so far, right? I think probably it was a big unexpected help that last year, because of the deterioration of relations between the two sides, China stopped Chinese tourists flying to Taiwan. So now it turns out to be a lucky scenario to Taiwan.
Yeah, as to the U.S., there's actually significant cooperation between the U.S. and China. And I think this is not honestly represented in the discourse of the Chinese leadership. And I think that's a problem. So the US CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, offered test kits to the Chinese to help in testing for coronavirus infections very early on. Because, I mean, you just have to pay basic attention to realize that there's a shortage of test kits in China and that they do not know the actual number of even severe cases. And China, on several occasions, apparently refused that assistance, even as they made claims to the world public that the US should help them more. And then ultimately, it was at the beginning of February that they accepted this help. And so now the CDC is supplying them, even as it is trying to supply US laboratories with test kits, which are for now relatively short in supply, even in the US itself. So it's an allocation of resources that's according to a global rationality with a view to the epidemic. Because obviously right now the priority is to try and contain this in mainland China as much as possible. So the CDC was involved in that, and at the same time, another problem that I see in the way the Chinese leadership related to this, and I think it's I don't quite understand this honestly, because there's to me no real point in it other than perhaps in terms of internal Chinese politics and trying to save legitimacy for Xi Jinping maybe. But they pointed out that the US is creating panic by introducing travel restrictions. And at the same time, look at the border between Russia and China. I mean, the Russians just closed it down. And so it's not a travel restriction, they closed the border. So it happened, at around the same time. And the rhetoric is fairly one-sided. It's a problem with one country, not so much a problem with another country. And such an inconsistency actually raises questions. Of course, China wasn't critical only of the US, but Southeast Asian countries as well received some criticism that, obviously have concerns. Yeah, but for now, I mean, it's a good air of cooperation as we speak just now. And Trump, as you're aware, has praised Xi Jinping, not necessarily on the basis of the empirical truth of the situation, but largely in terms of how it is healthy to offer this kind of support, and you know, exactly in order to have a constructive relationship at a time when cooperation is a must between anyone. Regardless of what other issues exist in these relationships, right now cooperation should be a priority for everyone, because, well, the scale of the issue is such that this is a global issue. It's a global interest, basically.
Thank you. Is there a last question? Dori, sorry.
No, that's okay. No, my question is...
It's a short question, please.
Yeah, okay. My question is regarding the youth, so the younger voters. Because in Japan, the younger voters, according to the reports, they are not so interested in the politics itself, because they are just living in Japan, but they are not taking care of such kind, and so one kind of questions. But what is the issue in the affected countries of this discussion? So India and Taiwan, and I mean the US. So are the younger people interested in the elections or not?
I think we have briefly touched upon this question a few minutes ago. So as I just told you before, 75% was the turnout in Taiwan, and youngsters were quite eager to go to vote. They supported mostly Tsai Ing Wen and then DPP. So I think there's nothing else to be added to that. And Peter also mentioned the importance of the youth in America.
Yeah, I'll second to that, effectively. I mean, obviously there are some issues that you could specifically identify as possibly mobilizing additional young voters. One such issue that just comes to mind, if I try to think of this quickly, legalization of marijuana, one such issue, for example, and other issues as well. So this is just a random example out of a few that could be used to mobilize voters, young voters, in various ways.
Yeah, I mean, the voter turnout at the 2019 elections was close to 67% in India, and you had many millions of first-time voters. But I think that there are, I mean, unlike maybe in the United States, I'm not sure about Taiwan, but there aren't really these issues. Even though youth unemployment is at a 45-year high, and these elections could have been run on the economy, but clearly there were some other factors at play, so I don't think that there are these issues which get the youth particularly excited any more than usual voting along either ethno-religious, caste, kinship lines.
Then thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much for your attention. Regarding the research group's upcoming events, we shall keep you updated on the usual platform. Thank you. Good evening.